They told Savannah to leave town. Simple as that. The sun was warm on the dirt street, but a chill had settled deep in her bones. Reverend Josiah Baines stood before her, flanked by 3 town elders, their faces carved from judgment and pine. They held their hats in their hands like they were at a funeral. Maybe they were, hers. "We appreciate your service, Miss Fairley," the Reverend said, but his voice was like gravel in a dry creek bed. "But this town doesn't need the kind of trouble your presence brings." Trouble. That was the word they settled on. It was easier than saying what they really meant. It was a clean word, a simple word, and it covered the filth of their lie perfectly. They didn't use the word loyalty. They didn't talk about the nights she'd spent with a cool cloth on Mrs. Bridger's boy, coaxing him back from a fever that had sent a doctor packing. They didn't mention the children of ranch hands, their faces lit by a single lantern, as she taught them their letters long after her own work in the boarding house kitchen was done. No. They didn't talk about the woman who stayed when so many others had fled for easier lives in bigger towns. All it took was one whisper, one vicious lie spun by a man with a silver star on his chest and an ego bruised black and blue. Sheriff Miller. He wanted something she wouldn't give, so he decided to take everything else. And just like that, Savannah Fairley, the woman who had mended their clothes and taught their children, became a plague. She swallowed the lump of iron in her throat. "I have done nothing wrong," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was straight as a rifle barrel. Reverend Baines shifted his weight. "You are not married. You live alone." "And the sheriff is a liar," she shot back, the words escaping before she could cage them. "And every single one of you knows it." But it didn't matter. Their minds were bolted shut. "You have until Sunday," Baines said, his voice final. "Be gone by then." She gave them a single sharp nod. There was nothing else left to do. That night, she packed. Her hands shook as she folded the few dresses she owned. The little room at the boarding house wasn't much, just 4 walls and a window that overlooked a muddy alley, but it was hers. She had paid for it with sweat and honest labor. Now, she was being thrown out of it like garbage. The next morning, she went to the schoolhouse. It wasn't a real schoolhouse, just a dusty room behind the church, but the children didn't care. They saw her, and their faces lit up. They didn't understand the whispers. They didn't understand the sideways glances from their parents. A little girl named Clara, only 7 years old, grabbed onto her skirt, her knuckles white. "But who will teach us our stories?" she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. Savannah felt her heart crack clean in 2. She had no answer for the child. She spent the rest of the day as a ghost, drifting through the town she had once called home. People saw her coming and would cross the street. They would study the sky, the dirt, anything to avoid meeting her gaze. Only Mrs. Bridger, the woman whose son she had saved, dared to approach. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks as she pressed a small jar of blackberry preserves into Savannah's hands. A final, small act of kindness in a town that had run dry of it. On Sunday morning, the church bells were ringing, but they sounded like a death knell to Savannah. She harnessed the old mule to a borrowed cart, her few belongings rattling in the back. She didn't look back at the church as she passed, didn't look back at the general store or the boarding house. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, a ribbon of dirt disappearing into the vast, empty hills. The sun climbed higher. Dust plumed up from the cart's wheels, coating her dress, her face, her spirit. And then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in her lonely exodus. The rhythmic thunder of horses' hooves coming up fast from behind. She pulled the mule to a stop and turned, her hand shielding her eyes from the glare. A lone rider was closing the distance, a tall silhouette against the blinding sun. He rode a lean bay horse, and he moved with the land, a part of it, not just a visitor. Her breath snagged in her chest. a cold dread and a flicker of impossible hope washed over her. She knew that horse. And God help her, she knew that man. Kellen Cade was back. He reined his horse in beside her cart, the animal dancing nervously. Dust clung to Kellen's long coat, and a 3-day beard shadowed a jaw set like granite. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over her, taking in her worn dress, the pathetic little cart, and the road stretching into nothingness. "What the hell are you doing, Savannah?" he asked, his voice a low growl rougher than she remembered. "They told me to leave," she said, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. "Said I wasn't welcome anymore." A fire ignited in Kellen's eyes. In one fluid motion he swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter, Kellen. It's done." He took a step closer, invading her space, his presence a wall of heat and fury. "You're not going anywhere." Before she could even process his words, a new sound reached them. The murmur of voices, the crunch of many boots on the road. She looked past him and her heart sank. It looked like half the town was marching toward them, a grim procession led by Reverend Baines and Sheriff Miller. The sheriff had his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. This wasn't a farewell party. It was a posse. Reverend Baines stopped a few feet away, his face pale and tight. "This is not your concern, Cade." Kellen didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on the sheriff. "She's with me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. The Reverend sputtered. "You've been gone for 2 years. You have no say here." "I came back," Kellen said simply. Then he finally turned his gaze to Savannah, and for the first time she saw something under the anger, something that made her stomach clench. "I came back for her." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of townspeople. Sheriff Miller's hand tightened on his gun. Savannah's mind was reeling. "You told me to go west," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You said it was safer." "It was," he said, his eyes holding hers. "But I was a fool to listen to my own advice. I should have stayed." "Why now? Why come back now?" "Because I heard what Miller was saying," he said, his voice dropping lower, a venomous edge to it. "And I know what he's really after." Sheriff Miller took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. "Now you listen here, Cade. This woman is a troublemaker. She's been poisoning this town with her loose morals." Kellen moved so fast Savannah barely saw it. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he was face to face with Miller, his hand clamped around the sheriff's wrist, twisting it until the man cried out and his hand fell away from his pistol. "You'll be silent now, Sheriff," Kellen snarled, "or I'll silence you permanently." He let go, shoving Miller back a step. Then he turned to the stunned crowd. "None of you know the real story, do you? You just followed your preacher and your lawman like sheep." He looked back at Savannah, his expression unreadable. "They don't want her gone because she's trouble. They want her gone because of what she knows." Savannah stared at him, utterly bewildered. "What I know? I don't know anything." Kellen's lips twisted into a grim, humorless smile. "Oh, you do, Savannah. You just don't know you know it." He raised his voice for the whole town to hear. "They want her out of the way so they can find what my brother hid before he died." The name of Kellen's brother, Liam, hung in the air like a ghost. Liam had been gone nearly a year now. The official story was that he'd gotten lost in a blizzard up in the high country, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. A tragic, lonely end. But the way Kellen said it, the word died, sounded less like a tragedy and more like an accusation. Reverend Baines found his voice first. "Liam Cade's death was a misfortune, nothing more. To suggest otherwise is slander." "Is it, Reverend?" Kellen shot back, his eyes narrowing. "Or is it just inconvenient? Liam wasn't a drunk. He was a good man who stumbled onto something he shouldn't have, and he paid for it with his life." Sheriff Miller puffed out his chest, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "You're talking crazy, Cade. Grieving has addled your mind. Now take your hands off me and ride on out of here before I arrest you for obstruction." Kellen laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You aren't arresting anyone today, Miller. You see, I've spent the last 6 months talking to people, cattle drivers, trappers, prospectors, people who saw things, people who saw you and the good Reverend here meeting with Liam just 2 days before that blizzard hit." The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably. They had come to see a sinner cast out, not to witness the town's foundations being ripped up by the roots. Savannah's head was spinning. Liam Cade had been her friend, a kind, quiet man who would sometimes bring her wildflowers he'd picked on his walks. He'd never mentioned any trouble. He'd never hinted at any dark secrets. "Kellen, what are you talking about?" she pleaded. "What did Liam find?" Kellen's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at her. "He found the truth, Savannah, about this town, about how it was built, and he left me a map to prove it." He then turned his focus back to the sheriff. "The problem is, the map is incomplete. It's a riddle, and Liam was smart. He knew they'd come after him, so he split the secret. He hid the proof, and he gave the key to the one person in this whole rotten town he knew he could trust." His eyes bored into Savannah. "He gave it to you." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He didn't give me anything." "Think, Savannah," Kellen urged, his voice intense. "The last time you saw him, what did you talk about? Did he give you a book? A trinket? Did he say anything strange?" Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The last time she saw Liam, he had come to the boarding house kitchen. He'd seemed distracted, sad. They had talked about the children she was teaching. He loved hearing about their progress. He'd always said that stories were the most important thing you could give a child. Stories. Stories. The little girl, Clara. Who will teach us our stories? That's what she'd asked him. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Liam, sitting with the children by the creek. He was teaching them a new song, a silly rhyme about a crooked house on a crooked hill where a red hawk nested. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it, just a simple tune. But now, the crooked house, the red hawk. There was an abandoned homestead 10 miles out, nestled at the base of a bluff known as Red Hawk's Ridge, a place no one ever went. "The song," Savannah breathed, her eyes widening in horror and understanding. "He taught the children a song." Kellen's jaw tightened. "What song?" "About a crooked house, by a hawk's nest." A flicker of triumph lit Kellen's eyes. He knew the place. They all did. Sheriff Miller's face went white as a sheet. He finally understood. It wasn't just a nursery rhyme, it was directions, and he had just tried to banish the only person who knew it. Before Miller could react, Kellen grabbed the reins of Savannah's mule. "We're going back to town," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. He wasn't asking, he was telling them. He started leading the mule and cart back the way they came, straight towards the silent, watching crowd. They parted before him like the Red Sea. No one dared to stop him, not the Reverend, not the elders, and certainly not the sheriff, who looked like he'd just seen his own grave being dug. Savannah walked beside Kellen, her mind numb. She had left town that morning a pariah, a lone woman cast out by lies. Now she was returning at the center of a storm, the unwitting keeper of a secret that could tear the town apart. A secret that had already gotten one good man killed. And as they walked back down that dusty road, she had the terrible feeling that the killing wasn't over yet. Kellen didn't take her back to her small room at the boarding house. He marched straight to the town's only hotel, a 2-story clapboard building that looked over the main street. He got them 2 adjoining rooms on the 2nd floor, paying the nervous clerk with a heavy gold coin that made the man's eyes go wide. Kellen placed Savannah in the room farther from the stairs. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone but me," he commanded. He dragged a heavy wooden chair and wedged it under the doorknob before closing the door to his own room, leaving her in silence. The silence was worse than the shouting. Savannah sank onto the edge of the lumpy mattress, the jar of blackberry preserve still clutched in her hands. Her world had tilted on its axis. Liam, murdered, a secret hidden in a child's song, and Kellen. He wasn't the same man who had left 2 years ago. The boy who had been scared to deserve her was gone. In his place was a man who moved with a cold, hard purpose. A man who looked at the sheriff not with anger, but with the flat, emotionless certainty of a hunter cornering his prey. An hour passed, then 2. Sunlight began to fade, painting the dusty window pane in hues of orange and purple. Finally, she heard a soft knock on the connecting door, followed by Kellen's voice. "Savannah? It's me." She unwedged the chair and opened the door. He was holding a plate with a piece of bread and some salted pork. He set it on the small table. He hadn't eaten either. "You need to eat," he said. "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stood by the window, peering down at the street below, a dark sentinel watching over a town that was holding its breath. "Why didn't you just tell them?" she asked, her voice small. "Why not tell everyone the truth right there on the road?" "Because truth doesn't mean much to a mob," he answered without turning around. "And it means even less to a guilty man with a gun. Miller would have started shooting, and people would have died. This way. They're scared. They're confused. They'll start talking to each other. They'll start wondering why their sheriff was so desperate to get you out of town. Fear is a better weapon than a bullet sometimes. It spreads." "So what happens now? We just wait?" "We don't wait. We act," he said, finally turning to face her. The last rays of sun caught the sharp angles of his face. "Tonight we go to the schoolhouse. You need to show me exactly what Liam taught the children, every word, every note. We need to be sure. And then? And then we ride out to that homestead before Miller and the Reverend figure out a way to stop us for good." His certainty was terrifying and comforting. He was walking into the fire, and he was pulling her with him. But at least she wasn't alone anymore. He was right. She needed to be strong. She picked up the bread and took a bite. It tasted like sawdust, but she forced herself to chew and swallow. As darkness fell, a hush descended over the town. There were no lamps lit in the saloon, no boisterous laughter spilling into the street. It was as if everyone had locked themselves indoors, waiting for the storm to break. Under the cover of a moonless sky, Kellen and Savannah slipped out the back of the hotel. They moved through alleys and shadows, avoiding the main street. The air was cold and still. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a gunshot. The schoolhouse was dark. Kellen picked the lock on the simple wooden door with a piece of wire from his pocket, a skill she hadn't known he possessed. They stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of chalk dust and old paper. Kellen lit a small shielded lantern, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Where did he teach them?" Kellen whispered. "Here? Or outside?" "Outside, usually," Savannah replied, her voice a hushed echo. "By the creek. But when the weather was bad, he'd draw on the slate board." She moved toward the large slate that dominated the front wall. It was covered in arithmetic and half-finished letters from the day's lessons. Her lessons. She picked up a damp rag and wiped it clean. "Try to remember, Savannah. Everything." She closed her eyes, picturing Liam's kind face, hearing the soft cadence of his voice. She remembered the tune first, a simple, meandering melody. Then the words came tumbling out of her memory. "The crooked man in the crooked house sits upon a crooked chair." Not that one, she muttered to herself. The other one. And then it came to her. Her eyes snapped open. She picked up a piece of chalk, her hand moving with a life of its own. She drew a crude shape, a bluff, a cliff face. "He drew this," she whispered. "He called it the Hawk's Beak." She drew a winding line at the bottom. "The creek. He called it the Snake's Belly." And then she drew a small, lopsided square nestled near the bluff. "And this. This was the House with a Broken Back. He called it that because the roof line sags in the middle." Kellen stared at the drawing, his expression grim. "The old surveyor's homestead. No one's lived there in 20 years. "There's more," Savannah said, her voice trembling slightly as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. "The last verse of the song. Go past the porch where the sun don't shine. Count 3 stones from the dying pine. What the father lost, the son shall find." Kellen's breath hissed out. "It's not just a map to the house, it's a map to something at the house." A floorboard creaked behind them. They both froze, spinning around. Kellen instantly blew out the lantern, plunging the room into absolute darkness. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. They stood motionless, listening. The only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts. Another creak. Someone was inside the schoolhouse with them. And they weren't alone. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Savannah could hear the soft scuff of a boot on the wooden floor, slow, deliberate. Whoever was in the room was moving with confidence, not fear. Kellen didn't move a muscle, his pistol aimed into the inky blackness. He was a statue carved from shadows and vengeance. The scuffing stopped. A match scraped against a rough surface, and a tiny flame flared to life. In the sputtering light, a face was illuminated. Not Sheriff Miller, not Reverend Baines. It was Mrs. Bridger, the woman whose son Savannah had saved, and she was holding a massive double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles pointing directly at them. "You two shouldn't have come back here," she said, her voice low and steady. The match went out, plunging them back into darkness. But the image of her was burned into Savannah's mind. The kind, grandmotherly face was gone. In its place was a grim mask of determination. "Mrs. Bridger?" Savannah whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done a year ago," the old woman's voice replied from the dark. Another match flared, this time lighting the wick of a lantern she'd placed on a school desk. The room filled with a soft, steady glow. She wasn't pointing the shotgun at them anymore. She was holding it loosely, resting the stock on her hip. "Put that gun away, Kellen Cade. I'm not here to hurt you." Kellen slowly, cautiously, lowered his pistol, but he didn't put it away. "You've got a funny way of showing it?" "Desperate times," Mrs. Bridger said with a sigh. "I saw you sneak out of the hotel. Figured this is where you'd come. Miller has men watching the place, but they're lazy. They're watching the front." She gestured with her head towards the back window. "I came in through there." "Why?" Kellen asked, his voice still laced with suspicion. "Because Liam asked me to," she said simply. "Right before he left for the mountains. He came to see me. He told me he'd found something terrible. Something that went back to the founding of this town. He said if anything happened to him, I was to watch over Savannah." Savannah felt a fresh wave of grief. Liam had been trying to protect her even then. "He knew, didn't he?" she whispered. "He knew they were going to kill him." "He suspected," Mrs. Bridger confirmed, her eyes sad. "He said Miller and the Reverend were getting greedy, trying to find something his father had hidden. He told me they wouldn't dare touch you as long as you didn't know anything. That's why he hid the secret in that song. He figured it was safe with the children. Who'd ever think to listen to a nursery rhyme?" "But they did," Kellen said. "Or they figured it out somehow." "They got desperate," Mrs. Bridger explained. "They've been quietly buying up land all around the old Cade property, looking for something. When you showed up, Kellen, asking questions, they panicked. They figured you knew something. and their next thought was that Liam must have told Savannah. Forcing her out was their only move. They planned to follow her, wait until she was alone and helpless in the wilderness, and then force the information out of her. The cold brutality of it chilled Savannah to the bone. The exile wasn't just cruel, it was a premeditated trap. Mrs. Bridger moved toward the back of the schoolhouse. She lifted a loose floorboard and pulled out a canvas sack. She dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud. Liam left this with me, too. Said you'd need it. Kellen untied the sack. Inside was a box of cartridges, a leather canteen, a thick slab of dried beef, and a folded oilskin pouch. He opened the pouch. Inside was a beautifully crafted hunting knife and a compass. He was planning for you to come back, Kellen. He was planning for this fight. She looked at them both, her expression deadly serious. You can't stay here. Miller's not a patient man. He'll make his move before dawn. You have to ride for the homestead. Now. We can't just run, Kellen argued. We need proof of what they did. And you think you'll find it by getting yourselves shot in the back alley of a town run by your brother's murderers? She countered sharply. The proof is out there where Liam left it. Go find it. Then you can come back and burn this whole town to the ground for all I care. But you have to survive the night first. She was right. Every instinct told them she was right. My horse is at the livery, Kellen said. And the mule, Savannah started. Already taken care of, Mrs. Bridger said. She pulled a set of reins from behind a bookshelf. I saddled my own horse for you, Savannah. She's faster and quieter than any mule. They're both tied up out back in the cottonwood grove by the creek. She's my best mare. You bring her back when this is over. The old woman's sacrifice, the quiet courage of her betrayal, was overwhelming. Savannah stepped forward and embraced her. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Bridger patted her back, her hand surprisingly strong. Don't thank me yet. Just get justice for that boy. Liam was worth 10 of these hollowed-out men. They slipped out the back window into the cold night air. The horses were exactly where she'd said they'd be, silent shadows under the trees. As they mounted up, Kellen paused and looked back at the darkened schoolhouse. How will we know we can trust anyone else? You can't, came Mrs. Bridger's voice from the shadows. From here on out, you trust each other, and you trust that a guilty man always makes a mistake. Now ride, and don't look back. They urged the horses into the creek, letting the shallow water muffle the sound of their hooves as they made their way out of town. They rode hard and fast, the wind whipping at their faces, the darkness of the open plains swallowing them whole. As they crested the first ridge, Savannah risked a glance back. The town was a small cluster of sleeping squares, but then she saw it. A single light, a lantern, moving quickly from the sheriff's office toward the hotel. Then another, and another. The hive was awake, and it was angry. They knew they were gone. The hunt had begun. The land beyond the town was a different world, vast and unforgiving. The moon had risen, a sliver of bone-white light that did little to pierce the oppressive dark. It washed the rolling plains in shades of silver and black, turning familiar shapes into monstrous illusions. They rode in silence, conserving their energy, their horses' hooves a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Kellen led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his body tensed for any sign of pursuit. Savannah followed close behind, the mare Mrs. Bridger had given her proving to be strong and sure-footed. The initial terror of the chase began to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. Liam's song echoed in her mind. Go past the porch where the sun don't shine. It meant the north side of the house. Count 3 stones from the dying pine. A landmark, simple, clear. He had made it so a child could understand it. He had trusted her to remember. The weight of that trust settled on her, a heavy cloak of responsibility. This was no longer just about her own survival. It was about honoring the memory of a murdered friend. An hour into their ride, Kellen suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for silence. Savannah pulled up beside him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she whispered. "Look," he murmured, pointing toward a distant ridge to their left. At first, she saw nothing but the dark line of the earth against the star-dusted sky. Then she saw it, a flicker of light, a campfire. It was too far south to be on the direct route to the homestead. "Are they trying to cut us off?" she asked. Kellen shook his head, his eyes narrowed in thought. "No, that's not Miller's style. He'd come straight on. That's someone else." The thought of another unknown player in this deadly game sent a shiver down her spine. "Who?" "I don't know, but they're not trying to hide. A fire like that can be seen for miles. It's either a warning or an invitation." "What do we do?" "We stick to the plan," he said, his voice firm. "We get to the homestead. We find what Liam hid. We deal with everything else after." He nudged his horse forward, but their pace was slower now, more cautious. The unseen watcher on the ridge had changed the equation. They weren't just running from the law now. They were moving toward a mystery. The homestead was located in a narrow canyon, carved out of the earth by a creek that ran swift in the spring and went bone dry by late summer. As they neared the canyon's mouth, the terrain grew rougher, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses. The air grew still and cold, the only sound the crunch of their boots on loose rock and the gentle whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. The house appeared suddenly, a darker square against the deep shadows of the canyon wall. It was a derelict structure, the roof sagging in the middle just as the song described. The Broken Back. A single skeletal pine tree stood beside it, its branches twisted and bare. The dying pine. This was the place. Kellen tethered the horses in a thicket of willows by the creek, well out of sight. "Stay here," he whispered to Savannah. "Let me check it out first." "No," she said, her voice resolute. "We do this together." He looked at her for a long moment in the dim moonlight, and then gave a single sharp nod. He drew his pistol. She grabbed a heavy fallen branch, a poor substitute for a weapon, but it was better than nothing. They approached the house like ghosts, moving from shadow to shadow. The front porch had long since collapsed into a pile of rotting timber. This was the porch where the sun don't shine. The north side. They circled around the back of the house. The dying pine stood about 20 yards from the rear wall. It looked ancient, struck by lightning years ago. At its base was a cluster of large gray stones. "Count 3 stones from the dying pine," Savannah whispered, the nursery rhyme sounding like a prayer on her lips. They knelt by the stones. The first 2 were half buried in the earth, solid and unmoving. But the third, a large, flat piece of shale, shifted slightly when Kellen put his weight on it. Working together, they managed to pry the heavy stone slab upwards. Underneath was not a box or a pouch, but a dark, gaping hole. An old, forgotten root cellar. A wave of musty, damp air rose to meet them. Kellen lit a match. The feeble light revealed a set of crumbling stone steps leading down into the darkness. "What the father lost," Kellen murmured, repeating the final line of the song, "The sun shall find." He took a deep breath and started down the steps, his pistol held ready. Savannah followed, her makeshift club held tight in her hands. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet square, with earthen walls held back by rotting timbers. In the center of the dirt floor was an old wooden crate. It was nailed shut. Kellen used the butt of his pistol to pry open the lid. The sound of screeching nails was deafening in the silence. Savannah held her breath as he lifted the lid away. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed canvas, was a thick, leather-bound book, a ledger, and resting on top of it was a single tarnished silver star, a sheriff's badge. But it wasn't the book or the badge that made Savannah gasp and stumble backward. It was what was tucked beside them. A human skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at them from the darkness. Suddenly a voice echoed from the top of the cellar steps, calm and chillingly familiar. "I was wondering when you'd get here." They spun around, Kellen raising his pistol. Standing at the top of the steps, silhouetted against the night sky, was a tall, lanky figure. It was the young man who was always with the widow, Mrs. Tannick. And in his hands he held a rifle, aimed directly at Kellen's chest. Kellen froze, his own pistol aimed up at the figure. For a heart-stopping moment, the only sound in the cellar was the ragged draw of their breaths. The young man didn't look threatening. He looked sad. His eyes, even in the dim light, held a deep, weary sorrow. "My ma said you'd come," the boy said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "She said the son of a Cade would always come back for what was his." "Who are you?" Kellen demanded, his voice a low growl. "My name is Thomas. My mother is Martha Tannick. My aunt was Eleanor Rice," he said, his voice cracking on the last name. "She was the surveyor's wife. This was her home." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The surveyor, the man who had owned this homestead 20 years ago, the man who had, according to town legend, simply packed up and vanished one day. This cellar wasn't a hiding place. It was a tomb. "That skull," Savannah whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "It's my uncle," Thomas said, his gaze dropping to the crate. "Elias Rice. He was the first man murdered for this town's greed, but he wasn't the last." Kellen slowly lowered his pistol, though he kept it in his hand. He understood now. This wasn't a threat. It was an alliance. "Your mother," Kellen said. "The fire on the ridge. That was you." "She sent me to watch for you," Thomas confirmed. "She knew Miller would run you out of town. She's been waiting. For 20 years, she's been waiting for someone to come looking for the truth." He lowered his rifle and walked down the steps, his boots stirring up decades of dust. He looked at the ledger in the crate with a kind of reverence. "My uncle was a meticulous man. He kept records of everything, every claim, every assay report, every private deal. When the founders of this town, Miller's father, Baines's father, and—" He paused, looking at Kellen with pity. "And your grandfather, Jonathan Cade, realized this valley was sitting on a massive silver lode. They tried to buy him out. He refused. He was an honest man." "So they killed him," Kellen finished, his voice flat and dead. "And buried him in his own cellar," Thomas affirmed. "They forged a bill of sale and filed a new claim in their own names. They built this town on a foundation of murder and theft. The ledger proves it all. Names, dates, secret agreements. It's all in there." Savannah stared at the book. An entire town built on a lie. Generations of people living their lives on stolen ground. "What about your grandfather?" Savannah asked Kellen softly. Was he one of them?" Thomas answered for him. "He was. But he was the only one with a conscience. According to my aunt's letters, Jonathan Cade was haunted by what they'd done. He tried to pull out to expose the others, but they threatened his family. Your father, Kellen, you. So he began to secretly sell off his own assets, turning them into gold, hiding it away. He planned to give it to my aunt and help her disappear, to start a new life, a form of penance. But he never got the chance," Kellen surmised, his face a mask of stone. "He died of a heart attack before he could," Thomas said. "The other families, the Millers and the Baines, they consolidated their power. They wrote the town's history to suit themselves. They convinced everyone the Cades were just poor ranchers who couldn't manage their money. But they always knew your grandfather had hidden that gold. They've been searching for it for 20 years. "And my brother?" Kellen's voice was barely a whisper. Liam started asking questions, Thomas said, his voice full of sorrow. He was looking into your grandfather's history. He stumbled onto some of the old records. He found my mother. She told him the truth. She told him about this place. He came out here. He found the cellar. He found the ledger. That's what he hid. Not gold. The truth. The ultimate betrayal. Liam hadn't been killed by strangers. He had been executed by the sons of his own grandfather's co-conspirators, all to protect a lie that was 20 years old. And Kellen's own family history was irrevocably tied to the crime. So the nursery rhyme, Savannah began. Liam knew he was being followed, Thomas explained. He couldn't take the ledger with him, so he put it back, along with the badge he'd pulled off Miller's father's old uniform, which was also buried down here. He created the song as a map for you, Kellen. He sent word to my mother what he'd done. He trusted that if anything happened to him, you'd come looking, and that my mother would be waiting to help. A sudden shout from outside shattered the stillness of the canyon. "They're in there! Surround the house!" Headlights cut through the darkness, their beams slicing through the cracks in the cellar's ceiling. Sheriff Miller had found them. Thomas's head snapped up. "Ma said this might happen. There's another way out, the original ventilation shaft. My uncle dug it to lead out to the creek bed. It's narrow, but we can fit." He ran to the back of the cellar and pulled away a stack of rotting planks, revealing a dark, narrow opening. "Go! I'll hold them off." "We're not leaving you," Kellen said, his jaw set. "You won't have to," Thomas replied, a grim smile on his face. He pulled a bundle of dynamite sticks and a long fuse from his satchel. "My uncle was a surveyor. He knew a thing or two about explosives. This whole canyon is going to come down on top of them. Now go!" There was no time to argue. Kellen grabbed the ledger, shoving it into his own saddlebag, which he'd carried inside. Savannah scrambled into the tunnel first, the damp earth cold against her hands. Kellen followed right behind her. As they crawled through the suffocating darkness, they heard Thomas shout from the cellar. "It's over, Miller! The truth is out!" A single gunshot echoed from the house, then another. Then a deafening roar shook the very foundations of the earth. The entire canyon seemed to groan and then collapse in on itself. A wave of dust and pressure blasted through the tunnel, pushing them forward as the world behind them ceased to exist. They tumbled out of the end of the shaft into the muddy bank of the creek, choking and gasping for air, as the historic homestead, the tomb of Elias Reese, and the final resting place of the courageous Thomas Tannick, disappeared under 1,000 tons of rock and earth. They lay on the creek bank, lungs burning, ears ringing from the explosion. The dust cloud was so thick it blotted out the stars, a choking shroud of pulverized rock and earth. The canyon that had stood for 1,000 years was gone, replaced by a mountain of rubble. Miller and his men were buried beneath it. Justice, swift and brutal, delivered by dynamite and gravity. But it was a victory that felt like a gaping wound. Thomas was gone, a boy they had known for less than an hour, who had sacrificed himself for a truth older than he was. Kellen got to his feet first, his face caked in grime, his eyes hollow. He looked at the landslide, at the final violent end to a 20-year conspiracy. He had found the truth, but the cost was staggering. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice raspy. "When the sun comes up, people will come looking. We need to be gone." Savannah nodded, her body aching, her mind numb with shock and grief. They found the horses, miraculously unharmed, and rode away from the devastation, the ledger a heavy weight in Kellen's saddlebag. They didn't ride back towards town. They rode west, into the Badlands, a desolate and empty place where they could think, where they could grieve. They found a small, sheltered box canyon with a trickle of fresh water from a spring and made a cold camp. Kellen took the first watch, sitting with his back against a rock, the ledger resting across his knees. He didn't open it. He just stared out into the darkness, a solitary figure wrestling with the ghosts of his family. Savannah watched him from her bedroll. The man she had once known, the man who had been afraid he wasn't good enough for her, had been forged into something else entirely. He was a man who carried the weight of his grandfather's sin, his brother's murder, and a young boy's sacrifice. How could they ever go back to a normal life after this? What did the future even look like? The sun rose, and with it came a decision. "We have to go back," Kellen said, his voice clear and steady for the first time since the explosion. "We can't let Thomas's death be for nothing. We can't let his mother think he died in vain." Savannah knew he was right. Running would solve nothing. The truth in that ledger was a living thing now, and it deserved to see the light of day. They rode back toward civilization, but they didn't go back to their town. They rode south for 2 days, to the territorial capital, a bustling city with a U.S. Marshal's office. They walked into the Marshal's office, dusty and trail-worn, and Kellen placed the ledger on the desk of a stern-faced man with a thick mustache and tired eyes. "My name is Kellen Cade," he said, "and this book will tell you the story of a town built on murder." For the next several hours they told their story. Every detail. The exile, Liam's song, Mrs. Bridger's help, the confrontation in the cellar, the explosion. Savannah's testimony was clear and unwavering. Kellen's was grim and precise. When they were finished, the marshal, a man named Harding, leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long time. "I've heard whispers about that town for years," he said finally. "Rumors of corruption, of the Baines and Miller families running things like their own private kingdom, but I never had anything concrete to go on." He tapped the ledger with a thick finger. "This changes things." A week later, they rode back into their town, but this time they were not alone. They were accompanied by Marshal Harding and a dozen armed deputies. The town was in chaos. With the sheriff and the reverend having vanished, buried, as only Kellen and Savannah knew, a power vacuum had been created. People were scared and confused. Marshal Harding rode straight to the church, where the late reverend's son, a pale and nervous young man, was trying to lead the Sunday service. Harding walked to the pulpit, the ledger in his hand. He didn't shout. He didn't make accusations. He simply opened the book and began to read. He read the surveyor Elias Rice's account of the silver discovery. He read the details of the secret partnership between the town's founding fathers. And then he read the final chilling entry, dated the day before Race disappeared, in which he detailed their threats against his life. The silence in the church was absolute. It was the sound of an entire community realizing their lives, their homes, their very history, was a lie. The children of the founders, now the town's leaders, were arrested. The assets of the Baines and Miller families were seized by the federal government. The truth, buried for 2 decades, had finally clawed its way into the light. In the aftermath, the town began to heal. Mrs. Tannick was given the deed to the land that had rightfully belonged to her family, along with a formal apology from the territorial government. Mrs. Bridger became an unlikely town hero, the woman who had harbored the truth all along. And Savannah and Kellen, the town they had been cast out of now, looked at them with a mixture of awe and respect. Kellen's family name was cleared, and the original claim filed by Elias Rice was honored, with a significant portion of the mineral rights being granted to Kellen as the last heir of the repentant Jonathan Cade and to Martha Tannick. But they didn't want the silver. They didn't want the town. They wanted peace. One morning they rode out to the edge of the bluff overlooking the land that was now theirs. It was a beautiful, wild piece of country, untouched by the greed that had poisoned the valley below. "We could build a life here," Savannah said quietly, looking out at the endless expanse of grass and sky. "A real one, on our own terms." Kellen turned to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, hammered silver ring. I didn't come back to rescue you, Savannah. You were never lost. I came back because you're the only thing that's ever felt like home. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. I'm not the same man who left, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I know, she said, her fingers curling around his, and I'm not the same woman you left behind. They stood there for a long time, the wind in their hair, the future stretching out before them, a clean, unwritten page. Their road had been paved with lies, betrayal, and death. But they had survived. They had fought for the truth, and in doing so they had found something even more valuable, a place to finally, truly belong. The story of this town serves as a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, always finds a way to the surface. If you enjoyed this story of justice being served and believe that the truth will always prevail, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we uncover next.